literature. I'll begin with Joe Flaherty, Writers and Books visionary founder, who recently passed. Rochester Reads was launched and sustained under Joe's passionate, joyful guidance. His legacy continues today with this keynote event. And this afternoon, Xochitl spent over an hour with School of the Arts writing majors who engaged with her brief reading and asked heartfelt, smart questions. Xochitl described fiction as a space in which to create restorative narratives, to craft historical corrections. These crucial functions of the written word are very much on my mind tonight and have been over the past few weeks, while reflecting on all that Joe set in motion when he dreamed up Writers and Books. Tonight, thanks are due our lead sponsor, Konar Properties, and the many organizations, individuals, and funders whose generosity takes Rochester Reads from concept to reality. I'm deeply grateful for our loyal board of directors who put their shoulders to the wheel in good times and in challenging times, providing the essential guidance and care that keep Writers and Books striving to make a difference. I hope you'll take a moment to acquaint or reacquaint yourselves with our purpose printed in your program book, and to read our justice, equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion and land acknowledgement statements. You're encouraged to browse our bookstores displayed tonight of Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Voices titles. 15% of your purchase will benefit Arnett Library's Social Justice Collection and Ganadigan Seneca Historic Sites public programs, respectively. There is no real work that is not a collective undertaking. There is no real work that is individual. Thank you, Writers and Books team, our staff. Your dedicated labor and belief performed every day fuel our organizational engine. And a special shout out is due our brilliant, wise artistic advisors for your enlightenment and commitment. Before I bring on Angelique Stevens, who will introduce Xochitl, please notice the very brief survey in your program book and consider taking it. It's a 5 to 8 minute task, and your candid input truly does help us steer the course with intentionality. Enjoy tonight's program, and please join me in welcoming Angelique Stevens.
Hello, thank you. I first met Xochitl at the Breadloaf Writers Workshop in 2018. I was lucky to be placed in Robert Frost's cabin with several other women my age. It was an incredible experience to be an emerging writer on the top of that gorgeous mountain in Middlebury, Vermont. The Wi-Fi was shoddy and the phone service intermittent, but that made it feel like a writer's camp. With 200 writers, we went to workshops led by literary superstars. We listened to lectures and panels in the evening. We shared our stories in the barn over cheap wine and snacks. That's where I met Xochitl. That's where she and I and so many others plotted our narratives and dared to dream of our successes. I think it was the first time that I realized how powerful it is to be in a community of writers. After we left the mountain and that high of writers camp, I thought that all those new friendships would fade into the past, but they didn't. Many of us continued to see each other at conferences, at AWP, at the same literary events we shared with each other on the mountain. Over the months and years, I watched as several of our Breadloaf friends took jobs as editors, facilitated their own workshops, and sold their books. It had the effect of motivating me in a visceral way. I had met real people with real dreams and uncertainties and fears, and I watched as they hustled their books out into the world. Their stories made me believe that I could do the same thing. And I think that's why we do what we do as writers, because we know that it's the stories that move people in profound ways. The title of Xochitl's first book, Olga Dies Dreaming, comes from a line in Pietro Pietri's poem, Puerto Rican Obituary. In it, Olga and several others died dreaming of things like $5 raises, like clean-cut lily white neighborhoods and $30,000 homes. They dreamed of belonging. They dreamed about how they could access this nebulous idea called the American dream. Xochitl's book, Olga Dies Dreaming, had that same effect on me. There's something about Olga that I related to and that I think we all can relate to. She's successful, she's independent, she's complex, and well, she's a bit of a badass. She's the kind of woman I did not see represented in pop culture when I was young in the 70s and 80s, growing up here in Rochester and dreaming about my own future beyond minimum wage, beyond the cockroaches, and beyond the cavities. Olga is a complex character navigating real world issues like identity, the income gap, gentrification, statehood, love, and liberation. And the second I put that book down at 3:00 in the morning, all I wanted to do was share it. As a member of the Writers and Books Artistic Advisory Committee, I can tell you that we had some hard decisions to make this year. We had several spectacular books to choose from, but in the end, we chose Olga Dies Dreaming because it engages with the critical issues of our time. It represents themes of family and cultural identity versus self-preservation, intimacy and abandonment, and the very real class stratospheres that make up the myth of the American dream. But at the core, it's a novel about becoming. It inspires us to conspire in the direction of our own futures and our own dreams. Xochitl herself is a bit of a badass. I saw that she went back to the mountain this summer as a special guest for Breadloaf's 2024 workshop. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our special guest and one of my literary superstars, the incredibly talented Xochitl Gonzalez.
Oh my gosh. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Rochester and Rochester Reads and everyone at Writers and Books and my friend and colleague whose own book will be coming out on Simon & Schuster in 2026, Angelique Stevens, for that beautiful introduction. And I also just want to say welcome and thank you to the women streaming in from the Monroe Correctional Facility. I'm so grateful for your time and for everyone's time in this room. Tonight, I'm going to opine a little bit on both what kind of grounds my work, tell a couple of true stories about me and the world, and read a bit from Olga and a little bit from my other book. I'm always actually, to be completely honest, a few years in and 2 books later, a bit uncomfortable talking about myself as a writer, because what I really think of myself is as a reader pushed by society into needing to write. You see, I was not raised in a family where writing was something that one could actually do. I was raised by my maternal grandparents, and they were very working class people from the Great Depression. My grandmother was a lunch lady at a public school. My grandfather was a janitor there at night. They had one GED between them. And my grandmother in particular was a very fearful person with not quite a high school education and very street smart, but a lot of things, ambition and people and places seemed far-fetched and maybe a little suspicious or risky to her. And so my family's ambitions for me were not to write, but to go to college and get a job in an office. My grandmother liked to call this going to business. She was like, I just want you to go to business with health insurance. And so instead, I went to college and somehow ended up schlepping around Manhattan
carrying tablecloths and flowers while I ran my wedding planning business for about a dozen years or so. And she completely didn't get this at all. She was just like, these people could buy a house with that money. It's like they have so many houses. Um, in fact, I was driven to write not so much by lofty ambitions or by some kind of romantic notion of the novelist quietly toiling at their work, but honestly by anger. And anger, I've come to discover, when channeled properly, can be a very powerful tool. So, what was I angry about? Well, in 2017, when I decided to write, it was so many things. In the wake of the seismic 2016 election, in the wake of watching my hometown of Brooklyn become utterly unrecognizable to me and inhospitable to people like my family, in the wake of Hurricane Maria and watching Puerto Rico be left to spoils of the ultra rich, well, it felt to me as if every aspect of my existence, my identity as a woman, as a person raised working class, as a New Yorker, as a Latina, was either being attacked or being ignored. And I'm from old Brooklyn and not new Brooklyn. And so when you feel attacked, you take off your hoops and you get ready to fight. But by 2017, I was 40 years old, and the only weapon I could imagine taking up was my proverbial pen. So tonight, I'm going to talk quite a bit about my Latinidad, my womanness, which is inseparable from my Latinaness, and my specific Latinaness, inextricable from my Brooklynness and my family's kind of working class roots. But I hope that in discussing my experience and in speaking to all of you, como mi gente, even if you're not Latino or Boricua or have anything to do with this culture, you'll find something in these words and stories to pull in to your own life and your own work. But before I get to all that, I want to talk about a story. It's a true story about a Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx. He's an only child. He's the apple of his mommy's eye. He's the scrawny kid, and to keep him getting beaten up by all the other kids on the block, he gets really good at telling jokes. And he figures out that telling jokes is also a pretty helpful way to get girls too. And he gets really good at it. He's still in high school and he's working comedy clubs all around downtown New York. And eventually, like something out of a movie, an agent spots him and signs him. And before you know it, this kid can't make it to his own high school graduation because he has to go to Los Angeles. He's been booked to do the Tonight Show, not the Jimmy Fallon Tonight Show, the one that really counted. And he goes on and they let him do some of his stand-up routine and he absolutely kills it. Millions of people see him, but more importantly, a TV producer sees him and realizes that this is the perfect guy to put in a new show that they are making for CBS. And he was. The show was about a Mexican-American kid who goes to work for an older white guy in an auto body shop in Los Angeles. They cast him in the pilot and taped it in front of a live studio audience. And the laughter was so loud at this kid's jokes they had to tape the entire episode a second time because you couldn't hear his lines over the audience's reactions the first time. The show was a massive success, the #1 show in America for the entire first season. Seemingly overnight, he becomes a household name. He's on magazine covers for magazines that are so niche you can't even imagine that they existed once, and on every talk show. He's hosting award shows and dating movie stars, and in all the gossip pages, he even has his own merch. T-shirts and mugs, todo. The comedian's name was Freddie Prinze. The show was called Chico and the Man. And the year that a Latino quite literally became the biggest name in American entertainment was 1974, 50 years ago. If you didn't know Prinze's story, but the name sounds familiar, it's probably because of his son, Freddie Prinze Jr. And if you didn't know Freddie Prinze Jr., then that means that you are very young, and I appreciate that. But the truth is, despite being on a hit TV show and starring in movies and playing in Vegas with the likes of Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack, after Prinze died, tragically by suicide, he was largely forgotten by all of those who knew him. His star quickly eclipsed by the rise of a young John Travolta. I probably don't need to tell you that rather than ushering in a new wave of Latino stars on screens big and small, the success of Chico and the Man was chalked up to a fluke, either to Prince's talent or to the moment or to the material. After a while, with no Latino characters on TV, a myth emerged, one all too familiar to anyone who follows the entertainment industry today, that no one would tune in to see a Latino-led show. Despite the fact that America had already proven this myth wrong, it took hold, and it was almost 30 years before a Latino had a starring role on a successful network show, the original George Lopez show from 2002. But the erasure of Prince's success is just but one example of America's collective cultural amnesia to the existence of Latinos. In my own lifetime, I have lived through at least 2, if not 3, Latin waves in pop culture. moments where America discovered this thing Spanish, much the way that Columbus discovered America. There was the great Latino explosion in the late 90s that had everyone living La Vida Loca and getting loud and watching Selena. I remember the 80s when everybody was singing La Bamba and feeling the conga with Gloria Estefan. Decade after decade, for nearly as long as there's been pop culture in America, there has been a moment where it had discovered its Latin flavor. And each time we watched the mainstream and of America delight as they danced to Mambo number 5 or Love Lucy like Desi did. And we sat with bated breath, believing that now, finally, America was embracing us as a part of their pop culture, only for the moment to pass, the Latin wave to wane, and to discover when the tide receded that the landscape remained utterly unchanged. A new stray celebrity with a Latino surname left here and there like detritus after a storm, and us, the Latino American masses, left feeling perhaps more foreign than ever. The recognition that we existed in the American consciousness as nothing more than a cultural fad cycled in and out every few years to quote unquote spice things up. It might seem silly to put such weight on popular culture, and I could stand here and repeat the sound case that representation matters for how we see ourselves and what we see as possible for ourselves, because that is true. But I will take that a step further and add this. In America, where popular culture is perhaps our greatest international export, the value one has in the culture is often reflected back in the value and import we are given in other arenas as well. In a society such as ours, when you are rendered invisible in the cultural conversation, it can be so much easier to be rendered invisible in other arenas as well. If your stories aren't told in the news or read in schools or reflected back in literature and films and television, it is that much easier for things like discrimination in mortgage lending or affordable housing or biases in healthcare to go unchecked and unquestioned because they are happening to people perceived not to matter. The truth is, we Latinos have been cast as extras in the narrative of this country, people lucky to get day work in the background, helping to tell the stories of real Americans. This is a matter of value put onto us by the mainstream. I mean, of course, that goes without saying, but also I think this is a matter of value being put on ourselves and our collective understanding about our relationship with this complicated country called the United States. In that spirit, I'd like to talk a little bit about the title of my first novel, Olga Dies Dreaming, which thanks Angelique for teasing that. I'd been toiling away on this novel about the daughter of former young lords who becomes a wedding planner to the ultra rich. Names are important, names mean things. And so I spent a lot of time researching, thinking about a name for her. And I landed on Olga after Olga Garriga, freedom fighter for Puerto Rican liberation, who was born in Brooklyn, but fought for La Isla. And as the real life daughter of activists who named me Xochitl, which was a name for Natural that meant flower or fertile, my parents are divorced. And that's not surprising when you know that it was a coin toss. And had I been a boy, I would have been Alberto, which is just after my grandfather. Anyway, here I am. But I knew that names meant something. And this felt like the kind of name that young lords would give their daughter. And they're these fictional revolutionaries. I was like, they're going to give her something with weight. And it had been important for me to make Olga's parents young lords because a lot of the news that we see around Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans until very recently has shown us as victims. And I knew that we had this kind of long history of organizing and rebelling and standing up for ourselves. And I wanted to assert that history that many young diasporicans didn't know. And I was researching the young lords and looking up their newspaper, which was called Palante. But instead of the newspaper, Dr. Google sent me to the song by a band called Hooray for the Riff Raff, Palante. And the video samples the very famous poem, the Puerto Rican Obituary. It was a poem, like a lot of our history, that I had known once, but I had somehow forgotten. In the poem by New York poet Pedro Preti, he walks us through the lives of 5 Puerto Ricans living in New York: Juan, Miguel, Milagros, Olga, and Manuel. And they all die dreaming of material things they wish they had, ashamed of their identity because they want to be accepted as American. The poem begins. They worked. They were always on time. They were never late. They never spoke back when they were insulted. They worked. They never took days off that were not on the calendar. They never went on strike without permission. They worked 10 days a week and were only paid for 5. They worked, and they died. And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is her. This is her struggle. And this is me. And so many of us, she is working so hard to survive. She is working so hard to be seen. She's working so hard to matter. She is working so hard to be accepted by people who will never accept her. She is both of these Olgas, Olga Garriga and this Olga. just as to me, Puerto Rico is both of these complicated things, just as I was both of these complicated things. And so I had my title, Olga Dies Dreaming, which felt important also because the title allowed me to say, this is part of a lineage of writing and art about our people and our values that has largely been forgotten. But also because Olga is about the past and coming to terms with her own past and the bad and the good and being proud of it. But it's also about the possible future where these characters are free to be fully themselves on their own terms. And in honing in on these themes for this one novel, I sort of found a guiding point artistically, thematically for myself as an artist and a writer at large to take and assert our forgotten and erased history and use it to help write for us new futures for ourselves, futures defined on our own terms. Despite the grim beginning of the poem, the last line of Puerto Rican Obituary has the 5 characters, Juan, Miguel, Milagros, Olga, and Manuel, finding themselves back with their people, back with their community. And it closes with the lines, Aquí, to be called Negrito means to be called love. And Negrito in Puerto Rican culture is such an affectionate, but you can see how in the wider mainstream it's perceived as something else. So it's a line about names and context, which in and of itself is a powerful idea. Names, as I said, have a lot of power. Let's take, for instance, the very hot button issue of my very own community on this last day of Hispanic Heritage Month. It's for me every day. Are we Latino? Are we Latinx, Latine? Are we Hispanic? It's seemingly simple question that I am constantly confounded by. Sometimes I find myself frustrated. Can't we just settle on a name for ourselves and get on to more urgent conversations? And then I think to myself, who are these names even for? These labels are not made for us to call one another. To one another, we call out mana, comadre, gente, familia. We know who we are. We need no words to call out to one another. When we step into a boardroom or a classroom where we are the minority, the other, and we see the other like us and breathe a sigh of relief because we know that at least someone else in the room will get it, we don't need words for that. We know who we are. When we're lost in a new city or even on a campus and we spot something familiar in a stranger that makes us feel it's okay to ask for help, we know who we are. We know new words to call out to one another. These labels are for the mainstream, for those who are not us, to try to categorize and define us, to make sense of us. But to name something is to tame something, and we have long been a people who refuse to be tamed. For generations, we've bucked against definitions put on us by government agencies, political parties, the media, and perhaps most aggressively of all, brands. And as such, we've defined ourselves less by stating who we are than by our assertions of who we are not. We are not one race. We are not of a unified national origin. We are not monofaith, nor are we a predictable voting bloc. We are neither all immigrants, nor are we all citizens. And perhaps, and most perplexing to the mainstream and exasperating to many of our parents and grandparents, we are not even all Spanish speakers. For a long time, I saw this anti-definition to be a bold act of defiance, a collective refusal to be saddled with presumptions and assumptions that did little for our community except to make us more discernible and digestible to those seeking to extract things from us, votes, consumption. Yet lately, I've come to fear that in our resistance to define ourselves, we've ceded our narrative to the mainstream. And in ceding that narrative, we have been relegated to the margins in this country. Although we are the largest minority group in America, somehow we continue to be othered, habitually rendered foreign to that which the mainstream tells us is truly American. While as individuals or as families, many of us may be new to this country, it's erroneous at best to paint Latinos and our collective culture as brand new to the American experience. In allowing this lie to perpetuate, we unintentionally enable the white American myth that's been so damaging to our diversifying nation. But also, in allowing this lie to perpetuate, we discount centuries of American histories that began with the first settlement in St. Augustine, Florida, written in our ancestors' blood. Back in 2019, when I sat down to write Olga Dies Dreaming, I had little notion of the change that this book would make in my life. I had no clue that this would open up an entirely new career, not just as a novelist, but as a journalist and a screenwriter. I had no credential when I sat down to write it that said I was qualified to do any of that. And while I had been an avid reader of fiction my entire life, I was not, admittedly, a student of literature. I was not from a family where reading was really that big of a deal or where writing was a career choice, nor was I, at that point, very well versed in the craft of writing. And I certainly was not aware of, nor frankly, particularly concerned with, the aesthetics of contemporary literature that the establishment tends to recognize with prizes and accolades. But what I absolutely was angry and frustrated. I'd read so many books and I'd not been exposed to any that reflected my experiences as a Latina, nor the experiences of so many women that I knew. Women who, of course, had struggles and obstacles and personal baggage, but who also had educations, had created comfortable lives for themselves, and had some sense of agency in the world, who were struggling not so much with who they are, as with how to be who they were in a society that doesn't value their best qualities. A society where success depends on prioritizing things at odds with the values of your culture and your family. But also in that moment, I was frustrated. I had been bearing witness to a slow motion cultural genocide happening to Americans at the hands of other Americans, and no one around me outside of other Puerto Ricans or diasporicans seemed to care. Or perhaps worse, they did not even know it was happening. It wasn't so much that the conditions created by Puerto Rico's long history of colonization hadn't been in the news. There were stories of the debt crisis, and Lin-Manuel had written op-eds, and resulting fragile infrastructure and the disastrous response by the American government to Hurricane Maria was absolutely covered by media outlets. There were even stories of the hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans left without power, without water, without open and functioning schools, forced to abandon their homeland and seek refuge on the mainland, a mainland where they were certain to face systemic discrimination and racism. But there was a disconnect between these reports and the egregious historical role that US policy had played and continues to play in the suffering and exploitation happening on the island, Puerto Ricans also known as American citizens. And I was angry also because I was watching the same thing happen by the same kind of powers that be to the diaspora that had been created in New York. And that I hadn't managed to put on the page, but it's true. Like it was like I was literally watching the New Yorker culture just get decimated by justification. And honestly, at that moment, somebody the other day said to me, "Why isn't Bad Bunny saying anything in this election?" And I was like, "Because Bad Bunny can't vote." I was like, "Why should he say anything in this election?" Puerto Ricans are half citizens, really. They are stripped of their right to vote in presidential elections with no votes in Congress, subject to taxation without representation. This, too, I began to realize in the years leading up to my writing Olga, was a historical fact that somehow slipped past the average American living in this country. I believe myself an optimist, despite everything that I just said. And from that optimism, I felt that was happening in Puerto Rico and to Puerto Ricans in the diaspora was enabled in part by this ignorance to our longstanding role in American history. And I'm not an educator, I'm not an administrator, I'm not a politician. And at that time, I was not a journalist. I've been an entrepreneur, a wedding planner to be exact. I was mainly schlepping buckets of water and tablecloths. I worked and worked and worked, but I was, and I've always been, like so many Latinos who've come before me, a great storyteller. And I've always known that in the best stories, they contain great truths. And so I set out explicitly not to write a polemic novel, not to try and tell a story that garnered sympathy for this shameful state of affairs, but a novel that was, in many ways, an expose of who we Latinos actually are, not as we are seen through the bureaucratic identity boxes of America, but as we see ourselves, to showcase the breadth of experiences that can coexist even in just one family. I set out to write an expose of the way in which 125 years of colonial policy and oppression and discrimination had shaped Puerto Rican people, specifically our communities, our families, our very persons. An expose of our actual history, not the one glossed over in school books, but the ones that we knew, or at the very least, the ones we deserve to know. The version where the heroes and the villains of the stories are not nearly as clean cut as we've been taught that they were. A version where the happy ending of America's liberty may not have yet been achieved, but we, nuestra gente, can help push to achieve it. But make it a beach read, a page turner, get a few laughs. I believed, and I think my instincts were right, that the only way to lure people into this story, to get them to acknowledge these truths, was to Trojan horse it. Start out with one thing, an acerbic wedding planner who tells it like it is and has a one-night stand with a hoarder, and let it slowly reveal itself to be another. Olga, the protagonist of my novel, is, as I was, a wedding planner to the rich. And I began the book with her scheming to steal these very luxurious, expensive napkins from her client. Olga isn't just stealing for no reason, of course. She's stealing the napkins to use at her cousin Mabel's upcoming wedding. But of course, because this is a Latino family, it isn't that simple. So in the book I write, Olga hated her cousin Mabel. Of course, it hadn't always been this way. Yes, Mabel had been a loudmouth girl who developed into a loudmouth, know it all woman, but despite this, they had been in their youth quite close. Slowly, though, a rift had formed and expanded. Then, last year, at age 39, Mabel was concurrently promoted to mid level management at Con Edison and proposed to by her long term boyfriend. The combination rendered her insufferable. Olga was only a year or so older, and for the entirety of their lives, Mabel had been in a one sided competition with her, where action of any sort in Olga's life was interpreted by Mabel as a sign of aggression and met with the, "So you think you're better than me, huh?" Truth be told, for most of their lives, using a traditional American metric for measuring success, Olga was better than Mabel. Olga had left Sunset Park, gone to a fancy college, started her business, had been featured in magazines and on TV, had traveled the world. What else did Olga do? Oh, gone to dinners costlier than one of Mabel's paychecks. But now, with this engagement, Mabel was going to achieve something Olga had never had, being a bride. Never mind that Olga bristled at the idea of third dates, let alone marriage. To Mabel, in this one arena, she had finally won, and she was not about to let her victory go unnoticed. On Christmas Eve, drunk Uncle Tito, she waved her engagement ring in Olga's face, repeatedly saying, "Julio got it from Jared's, bitch. What did you get?" That's right, nothing. At the bridal shower that her family pressured her to host because she's the one with all the party hookups, Mabel gave her a toast to her cousin Olga, who can help the brides. She just can't get the groom. Olga had taken this in stride, primarily because if finding someone like Julio to be tied to for all eternity was the one contest she would lose to Mabel, then she had chosen well. She was equally placated, knowing that when the time was right, she would think of the perfect fuck you gesture to take just a bit of wind out of Mabel's sails on her wedding days. Just the right little something to be the pebble in her shoe when she reflected on the day. It was during her sixth meeting with Mrs. Henderson, the mother of today's bride, specifically about the topic of napkins, when the idea came to her and she was immediately filled with delight, knowing that she could strike two birds with one tiny stone. So Olga's client had really put her through the ringer with these napkins. She orders hundreds of these linen napkins at $30 a piece and won't listen to reason when Olga tries to explain it's unnecessary. And then Olga finally decides to just take them. And so in the book I write, Olga did not see this as theft as much as an equalization of resources. Mrs. Henderson had aggressively accumulated too much of something while her family had acutely too little. At the Henderson wedding, despite all the time and energy spent discussing, procuring, pleating, and angling these napkins, they would go unnoticed. But at Mabel's, like a black Chanel suit and a sea of knockoff Hervé Leger bandage dresses, they would stop people in their tracks. Que elegante, she could hear Titi Lola saying. She could picture Theo Richie holding two of them over his chest and saying, "How many do you think I need to make a guayabera?" There would be countless cousins uttering simply classy as they thumbed the fabric between their fingers. This was the least Olga could do, she felt. Why shouldn't her family get to know the feeling of imported Belgian flax on their laps? Because Mabel's father was a janitor? Because that was the job he could get after he dropped out of high school? Because he dropped out mainly because he was dyslexic? A disorder that the family only learned of, mind you, when one of his grandchildren was diagnosed with it at school. And Theo Jojo, to comfort the child, said, "It's okay, mijo. I've seen the letters backwards my whole life, and I've been okay." Her family should have to wipe their mouths with $3 polyester rags because Theo Jojo's teachers were too fucking lazy to ask why he struggled with reading, because no one blinked at another dumb Puerto Rican dropping out of a shitty public high school. Fuck that. Also, it was doubtless that her family would attribute this elegant touch to Olga, and that would absolutely kill Mabel. Titi Lola, Theo Richie, Theo Jojo, all of them would immediately know that this was something only Olga would think to do. After the cousins said the word classy, then they would say Olga. That was just the way it was in her family. This was her role. The book starts with the justified theft of napkins and ends with the justified reclaiming of the island of Puerto Rico. And along the way is a pretty wild ride, but the response to Olga from readers from all walks of life has been tremendous. This book has recently gone into its 9th printing in just 2 years. It's amazingly, thank you. As I got to experience today, it's being taught in high schools and colleges across the country and even abroad. It's been the topic of dissertations and discussed in symposiums. It was featured in a Chanel ad and a New York Times crossword puzzle. I cannot begin to enumerate to you the number of emails and notes and DMs I've gotten from non-Latinos astounded by this part of American history that had never once made its way to them. But it was what I heard from Puerto Rican readers, from diasporican readers, and Latino readers from across the country that not only filled me with pride, but with purpose. from Puerto Ricans on the island who have been fighting to keep a foothold on their own home amidst neglect of public services and land grabs by rich Americans protected with tax shelters. I have heard thank you. Finally, in the mainstream was our history for people to really contend with. From diasporicans, what I had heard first broke my heart before it eventually filled me with joy. Story after story of having been raised in the shadow and cloaked with the shame of stereotypes that Puerto Ricans were lazy, that we were inept and unable to govern our lives, let alone our own island, stereotypes meant to reinforce a power structure. These readers suddenly felt themselves filled for the first time with pride. They would write to tell me that this book was the first time they'd been exposed to our real history, not just of oppression, but of our legacy of resistance, not just of the young lords who my protagonist's family was part of, but of the Taino, of the slaves who rebelled, of the islanders who created our very first flag. Many of these letters came to me with personal pledges to assert themselves, their Boricuasaness, more firmly. And from Latinos at large, what I heard again and again was how empowering and refreshing it was to see themselves, no matter their national origin, in a novel. To read a story that didn't play within the lines of how we were supposed to tell our stories, that took change of the charge of the narrative and what it is like to be a Latino in America and wrestled it away from stereotypes, but also from the marginalized place in our history books that we've been placed over time. The reception to the book has only emboldened me to speak further out in truth as I know it. In the Atlantic magazine, I've been able to confront other American myths that were centered in white experience. I've challenged the notion that Latinos are monolithic political bloc, that there's nothing electoral government can do about Puerto Rico's status, and the assumption that being Latino means speaking Spanish. And I have taken on the need to end Latino anti-Black bias. For this work, I was named a finalist for the 2023 Pulitzer Prize. In my newest novel, Anita de Monte Laughs Last, through my character of Raquel, a first-generation New Rican girl studying in an Ivy League in the 90s, I took a critical look at the compromises Latinas need to make within themselves to excel in spaces like academia or the arts, which are defined by white aesthetics. But I also wanted to poke at the myth of the grateful immigrant. As a child, the titular character in the book, Anita de Monte, was sent from Cuba to America on Operation Peter Pan, a U.S. government intervention that saved Cuban children from communism by taking them away from their parents and airlifting them to America and placing them in foster homes and orphanages. As an adult, Anita is now a working artist and a U.S. citizen, but she's anything but grateful. Early in the book, after a disagreement with her art dealer, who is only trying to help her draw a crowd, Anita says, "It was obvious that I annoyed her, not for calling out her hypocrisy, but for seeming ungrateful. Little brown immigrant girl getting this big, shiny white chance in the city. Why couldn't I just take my opportunity and like it? And I didn't know why, actually. I only knew that I couldn't." The book was a Reese's Book Club pick, an instant national bestseller, and is in development to become a feature film. I don't speak about my work to boast of success. In fact, I'm actually always really embarrassed by it, but to present to you affirmations of my choice as an individual and as an artist to embrace radical honesty in talking about American Latinidad in every space that I go into. I do not write about us as America would necessarily like to see us or thinks they understand us, but from my vantage point of who we really are. And I would like to take this moment, this opportunity to invite all of you here tonight in your various capacities and existences to walk into every space and do the same, whatever your background or experience. Too often we reserve our honesty and frustrations about our lived lives for when we are together in community with people who share our background. Too often we let small microaggressions and stereotypes wielded around by the mainstream stand, not because we are weak, but because we know who we are. What does it matter what other thinks? But I believe firmly that just as my career and life has opened up in response to speaking loudly and proudly about my lived experience as a Latina, so will our power as Latinos in this country grow as we assert in our various capacities the whole of our unique American experience into every arena we enter. It is only in this way that we can take this narrative as continually being brand new and end it, and by extension, stop being forgettable. There is power in not waiting for permission. There is power in seizing the narrative. There is empowerment in seizing the narrative. And actually today, I think when I was at the School of the Arts and I was talking to these kids and they, I gave them a prompt about like, what's something political? Like it could be small, like that's a big thing. That's like a media thing that makes you feel flat or like not seen in your real existence. And the things that I heard, we talked about gun violence, we talked about misrepresentation of mental illness on social media, we talked about the environment. And I said to them, I was like, then turn these all into stories, because it feels like you can't fix it as an individual in the world, but as an artist, you can change your relation to it by putting it down and controlling the narrative. Um, anyway, there is empowerment in seizing the narrative. And the truth is, we cannot afford to not seize our narrative. Today, Latinos stand at 18%, nearly one-fifth of the American population and growing. And yet, in the nearly 50 years since Freddie Prinze was on the air, we still represent only 2.9% of leading roles on screens. We're only 2% of all elected officials. We're less than 7% of published authors. Latinos represent $3.4 trillion in economic spending potential, but only 5% of C-suite executives. We're nearly 25% less likely than other Americans to have health insurance, while nearly half of us live in areas with inadequate healthcare systems. And despite the number of Latinas earning bachelor degrees quadrupling over the past 2 decades, the Latino wage gap is actually the most stark, with Latinas earning just 57 cents on the dollar to their white male counterparts. And if those stats make some of you angry, I'm not necessarily sorry, because as I said, I believe anger, when focused, is a powerful agent of change. But although I am a storyteller, I'm not naive enough to believe that changing our narrative alone will lead to greater power. That, I think, can only be achieved through community. In honesty, both of my books were actually not really well reviewed by white reviewers in the New York Times. It was it was particularly stinging to me, being a native New Yorker and all, until a friend emailed me a link to a 1987 two-star review from Rolling Stone of one of my favorite Spanish language albums of all time, Linda Ronstadt's 1987 release, Canciones de mi Padre. Released at the height of her fame as a pop and country star, Ronstadt recorded this album full of Mexican songs that the critic referred to as the gag of the year. White media thought it was a joke, but for me, as a young Latina girl who adored Linda Ronstadt until this moment had no idea that she was Latina, that album gave me a whole new sense of pride. And I wasn't alone. Rolling Stone be damned, Canciones has sold more than 10 million copies and was inducted in 2021 to the Grammy Hall of Fame. I relay this story to say this, and I speak to the Latin experience, but again, this applies to anyone in this room who is perceived as other, who is pushed to the periphery. We may never be invited into the mainstream. We may never be understood. But when we come together and assert ourselves as we authentically are and support those stories and missions and act like pieces of art that do, we have the power and the ability to change it. My first book was not picked up by any major book clubs. I mean, I go off on a morning show. Who thought I was going to be on GMA? But, like, but one editor told me before I sold the book that I'd have a bestseller on my hands if I just removed all the stuff about Puerto Rico. Yeah, my book hit the bestseller list, not the first week as is customary, but the second, because Latino readers could not stop talking about it and buying it for friends and passing it on to others. And because of those Latino readers, more politically engaged Latino books have been published by major publishers and marketed not as niche, but general fiction than ever. Bad Bunny, singing only in English, had the power to do to the music industry what no Latino who's attempted to cross over ever has, smashing records and bending the Grammys to his will. In media, independent companies like Futuro Media Company, which produces podcasts and journalistic investigations in English and Spanish, have won Pulitzers and Peabody Awards for their reporting. For too long, we've been sold a story of America that leaves us out, renders us perpetual newcomers, grateful to have been invited to the party at all, let alone get a plate of food. But we have paid our dues in this country. We have served in wars and sacrificed and suffered indignities. We have put down roots here. We have grown our communities. The time of waiting to be welcomed is over. Now is the time to gather together, to lift our voices, our American voices, and demand for ourselves, for our communities, for our culture more. So I want to leave you with a passage from my newest book, Anita de Monte Laughs Last. The book itself is a bit of a reclamation. As I mentioned, the title character is a Cuban-American immigrant, and she's inspired by the real-life artist Ana Mendieta, who was murdered in 1985. And in my fictional novel, Anita de Monte is dead, narrating much of the book from her afterlife, and frankly, really pissed off about having been killed. Anita is Cubana, she's very spiritual, and I just didn't imagine her afterlife involving St. Peter and the pearly white gates. Instead, her death is grounded in Taino death mythology and the Orishas of Sendera. She is able in the afterlife to move between worlds in the form of a bat. And it was a reader who sent this passage to me and told me it spoke to her of what it takes for those of us maybe not in the mainstream to take off. Many people don't know this, but bats cannot fly the way normal birds do. Normal birds can just stand on their delicate little feet, widen out their wings, give a couple of flaps, and find themselves soaring in the air, one moment grounded, the next propelling themselves higher and higher up in the sky. Ascension, the motivation, but not the bat. Their wings are too heavy to build momentum. For the bat, the only way to soar is to first allow yourself to fall, to disorient yourself to the world and hang upside down. And when you feel certain that you want to go up, allow yourself to actually go down, to release what branch you are clinging to and to drop, plummet, plunge, not up, but down, having full faith that when you spread your wings, your strong, majestic, perfectly constructed wings, you will catch wind and fly higher than you ever knew you could go, to anywhere you wanted to be. Thank you all very much. And thank you. I think we're taking questions. We're going to take a couple questions. Thanks so much. Oh my gosh.
If anybody has a question on either side, just raise your hand, please. Happy to give you the mic. We've got about 10 minutes for Q&A, so please feel free to speak up. Or I'll start calling on
A
people.
shy crowd.
Hi. So I want to know why the title's called Olga Dies Dreaming. Why did you choose that title? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, it was in the poem that I read a little bit of that I didn't get to. The characters in the next sort of section of the poem, it starts to go. Juan dies dreaming of lotto tickets. Olga dies dreaming of diamonds at one point, and they're like cubic zirconias. And so it's sort of a refrain of the way that they all die dreaming of something, and the things that they die dreaming of are sort of material and like aspirational or like hope filled, like, you know, like dies dreaming of winning the scratch off lotto, you know, like literally that's one of the things. And so originally I said to my best friend, I was like, what do you think about Olga dies dreaming of diamonds? And she's like, I think that's terrible. And then I just like sort of ended it with Olga dies dreaming because it felt like the perfect reference. But and then in the book, I do sort of like get into a section of the poem comes up a couple of times repeatedly in the book. So yeah, that was and it felt like an important thing to kind of connect it to that really iconic poem, Puerto Rican Obituary. Yeah. Hi. Oh, somebody up front. Oh, and then back.
One
Okay.
Back here, and then we'll come up to you.
Just have to break the ice.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing. My question is, what are some of your favorite authors, and what resources would you recommend to learn more about the Lords?
Oh, okay. I'll start with the Lords first because like that, I'm like, okay, there's an amazing book called Through the Eyes of Rebel Women. And it's like I wouldn't even call it an oral history. They kind of composited writings and interviews at the time, which I thought was just really, really great. And then there's a documentary that I don't know how easily, you know, I did a lot of my research at Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. And so I screened it there at the time, but I think it's distributed now, but it's called Palante, which is Palante, and it means to keep going. And it sort of was like the title of the Young Lords newspaper, but it's also a pretty common phrase in Puerto Rico. And then there's another book, and it's called Palante, and it's kind of a similar oral history / essay collection about the Young Lords. And I found those to be really, really good. Like there's a couple of great, and then there's actually, We Took the Streets is, oh my God, Mickey, and I'm blanking on his last name, but he was a Young Lord, and it's kind of his memoir. And that's also a pretty great thing. Yeah. Like it's an amazing movement to read about. It really they were largely inspired by the Panthers, but, they did amazing social justice, not just social justice work, like social activism work and kind of honestly getting deeper into it. They took over a hospital because they were underserving people and like they were going to shut it down. They did lead paint testing in their communities. They took over a church that like they needed a community center and basically were like, you're getting like tax-free land. Why aren't you opening this church up to the community? Like they did a lot of really kind of like eye-opening stuff. Yeah. Yes, that's right. Thanks. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Yeah. They were just like, it was pretty badass. Yeah. There's a question up here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have been gazing at the illustration of the cover, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the choice of the cover and
Yeah.
sort of its meanings.
So my editor forgets that I was a wedding planner. And so she did the wedding planning trick, which is like, show me 3 ugly things and 1 really beautiful thing, and then hope that you steer me into it. So it was like, did she think it was going to be between this or the cover of a stiletto heel poking the Puerto Rican flag? Like I wasn't doing that. But no, I was a visual art major. I micromanage everything about these books. Lauren, oh my gosh, like I'm blanking on Lauren's last name. Lauren, who did the cover, she just was such a sensitive reader. And I actually want to say, like, you know, when we were putting this together, it was in a moment where like, I wanted to say, like, I was very happy that I kept myself open to the artist that interpreted the book the best, like in the sense that, you know, theoretically, Lauren and I have nothing in common, but she just really got the book in a visual sense. And like, you know, the one thing that was different was, clearly I know where Lauren lives in Brooklyn. Like the Watchtower building, which is what we call that building, was the clock tower building was like the top of the Brooklyn Museum. And I was like, okay, nobody knows what that is. Like I was like, make it the clock tower. Like, and the clock tower is in the book, but like it was minor stuff. We changed her hair a little bit, like, but you know, I mean, it's beautiful. And actually it was like, we've not wanted, none of the international editions have wanted to change it so far. Like we're doing, like, you know, I was like, I really wanted the Spanish cover to be the same. And then the Italian edition comes out in 2 weeks. And like, yeah. And like, it's like a variation on the theme. So, you know, Lauren just really kind of got it. And I don't know, it's very, it's full of just, sorry, now I'm going to go wax poetic, but Brooklyn is in her chest. And then this kind of represents the island, like the floor, that's the national, it's the hibiscus flower, it's the national flower of Puerto Rico. And then obviously the stars are kind of the American flag. So it's got actually a lot of symbolism in there. And the blue is like, it's like a whole, whatever, I won't like bore you all with this, but like there's 2 blues. So if you see a Puerto Rican flag and it has a navy blue, that is the flag, like kind of pro statehood. And if you see a flag that has this blue, more of a wagon wheel blue, that's an independence flag. Anybody else? Oh, hi.
Hi, thank you so much. I have like all of these threads for a question, so, or I also don't need to stand, but that I'm gonna try and pull together. But you mentioned sitting down to write this book and not necessarily having much education or much history within the craft of writing, specifically those like white standards and the white aesthetic of what good literature is or what's deemed good literature. But I noticed that you went to the Iowa Writers Workshop for your MFA. And I think when we think of these like academic spaces, especially ones that teach literature, capital L literature, whatever you want to consider it, to kind of promote and further promote those ideas. And then your most recent novel, which kind of follows a young artist dealing with some of those same things. I was curious if you worked on Olga Dies Dreaming at Iowa, what that process might have been like.
So I walked in with 200 pages of Olga and I was 20 years out of school. My classmates were mainly 25. And when they would say, have you read Rachel Cusk? I was like, no, but have you read White Teeth? And the answer was usually no. You know, like I just wasn't reading what they were reading. And I was kind of impervious to my brain being changed at that point. And I think actually Sam Chang, who runs the workshop, said to someone, I don't think Xochitl will change anything about that book that she doesn't feel like changing about that book. Like, and that was true. Like, I think I didn't I had done being on the back of my heels, indebted, grateful student at an institution. I no longer felt that way. It was free. So like, I was like, and this program is free. This is amazing. So like, but on the other side, you know, I thought I would go and I would have all this time to read all these books. Like I studied art history and fine art in college, and I worked 40 hours a week for 4 years. So I did not get to read for pleasure until I got a real day job and I graduated. And that was like in the 2000s. So anything that kind of came out around that time, like I devoured, you know, like that's probably what influenced me. I never answered the question about books. Like I was really like early Gary Steingart, Zadie Smith, like all like, oh, John Irving, like I was like, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, like I like is like a saint to me. Like that stuff really, you know, for like my second book, like I finally got to let out a lot of my Stephen King, like, you know, like, but like I read a lot of I thrived reading VC Andrews, whoever she is, you know, like and I got through. A friend of mine died, and I think I stayed up for 3 weeks straight reading all the Elena Ferrante Neapolitan novels, but I was reading them as a reader. You know what I mean? And so then when I got to Iowa, I thought, oh, now I'm going to get to read all these books, except that I took a novel class my first semester, which meant every week I was reading somebody's novel. And then I was working on my own novel. And by the time I got into my second semester, I sold the book and it was COVID. And by the time I got into my third semester, I was trying to make this book a TV show. So that leisure time to get influenced by contemporary canonical literature, which I think we should say is very different and trendy. It just didn't really get into my brain. You know what I mean? So like, I don't think I get like, I don't even want to say I intimidated by that question. I don't think I get intimidated by that question as much as I think a lot of literature has gotten very academic because a lot of writers support themselves by being academics. And so the way we talk about books has gotten so academic. And the way we talk about what makes a good book has gotten, the aesthetic of it has gotten so academic. And I still think of myself as a commuting writer. You know, like I read when I'm on a plane. Now I commute and I go on a plane to Rochester, but that's really like, is it amusing me? Like, do I want to take the hardcover? Like, that's how I still judge a book, to be totally honest. I'm like, I don't want to put this down. Or I'm like, you know what? I was like, it's not on my Kindle. I'm not taking it. Like, so I don't know. I think my path to doing it sort of left me a little out. I don't want to say outside. I mean, I'm inside, but on the other side, I just don't think that I have the same aesthetic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Time for one more.
Hi.
Hi. My question is sort of a follow-on from that because I've been a longtime reader of The Atlantic,
Yeah.
and I'm very curious how, as someone who doesn't have a journalism background and, you know, not.
I'm so glad you
Yeah.
asked the story
How
because
has
it's a
it been?
fun
Yeah.
story.
Okay.
So actually, when I decided if I planned another wedding, I was going to drop dead. I didn't know what to do because I had people on payroll, right? Like, and I don't want to do it anymore. It's very difficult to extract yourself from a business. And my business partner and she didn't want to do it either. And so we were like, what do we do? And so I just called ladies that I'd met over the years that had been impressive to me in some way, shape, or form, you know, not in the big eye impressive, but just impressive to me. And I'd met this woman through Brown alumni stuff. And we met at a Brown alumni event. And then she invited me to a luncheon. It turns out that she did like NGO work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around women. And she invited me to a luncheon for like the UN General Assembly. And it was like me and all these women in like global women affairs work. And I was like, I plan weddings, but you know, like I was really moved by the fact that she saw me in this space, and it shifted my perception of maybe what I could be and how I thought of myself. And so when the early books were ready, I sent it to her. And a couple months later, she called me up and she was like, I read your book and my 2 adult daughters read your book, and my husband felt left out because he was the only one in the house that hadn't read your book, and I let him read it. And now he wants to Zoom with you. And did I mention to you that my husband's Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And so then I was taping the pilot of Olga. And so we tried to find time in between tapings, and I was taping the pilot in Sunset Park. And so Jeff gets on the phone and he said, you know, I mean, my family was from Brooklyn, and we started talking about all these things, Brooklyn. He was like, and now you're like have this book coming out, because the book hadn't come out yet, and you're shooting this pilot. And I was like, oh yeah, yesterday it was my birthday and we were shooting in Sunset Park. And Jeff Goldberg goes, yesterday was your birthday? Yesterday was my birthday. And I said, get the fuck out of here, Jeffrey Goldberg. And like right before then, I had thought we were having this very, like, I was like very, you know, I'm like, oh, it's the Atlantic. Like, this is so cool. He wants to talk about my book. And then the next thing, you know, after that, like the ice was broken and they were about to launch these subscriber newsletters. And he was like, he's like, I didn't intend to do this at all. He was like, but write a newsletter and you can write about whatever you feel like every week. Like, but like kind of through the lens of being from Brooklyn and this place gentrifying. And so then we came up with the title Brooklyn Everywhere. And then I started out, you know, there were some amazing people that had those newsletters that had like giant followings that they brought in from Substack. And I started out with like nothing. And like, for some reason, it just took off. And so then they asked me to come on staff, and the WGA was about to go on strike. And that's how I was getting my insurance. And here you have it. Many decisions are informed by practicality. But no, it's been a wonderful place. And I have to say that I had no training, but the standards with which they hold at the Atlantic for reporting, for fact checking, for copy editing, like you now, I mean, it's like wild. I did a profile of my mom, who kind of was the inspiration for Blanca for the September issue. And they let me report that for almost 6 months. Because like I sent it a draft after 4 months. They're like, you need to find her running mate, because she'd run for vice president of the United States. My mom was the first Latina to run for a national office on the Socialist Worker Party ticket in 1984. So like, yeah, also a crazy woman, but that's okay. But like, you know, I'm impressive and not around, but like, you know, it's complicated, which is what the piece is about. But then, you know, I went out and I found more people to talk to, and like they, so it teaches you quick. It's the best paid journalism school. I got really lucky in this phase of my life. I learned how to write screenplays and produce a TV show on Disney's dime. And then luckily Jeff basically paid for journalism school. So that's really nice. But I don't think, I say this all the time, and I said this today when I was at the high school, like, you learn things as you go, right? Like this same opportunity to, first of all, I couldn't have written this book any younger at all. And from that came these other opportunities. But second of all, I wouldn't have been able to manage it. Like it was the experiences that came through all of those years that generate my perspective, and that then makes my perspective more interesting. And so I think everything happens the way it's meant to happen. Yeah.
One more round of applause, please, for Rochester Reads 2024 author Xochitl Gonzalez. Thank you so much for tonight. Want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. Thank you to Debbie Himmelsbeck and Jake Buck at The Strong, with who this would not be possible. To our interpreter, Wayna Jefferson, thank you so much for being here. When you exit the theater, to your left, you're going to head towards Big Bird, and that's where the book signing is. So laugh about that. Thank you all for coming. Get home safe tonight.